let's kick off with some questions. Are you ready, guys? Okay, so let's start with a biggie and jump in as you see fit. So the question is, what are some of the biggest challenges in preventing the exploitation of children? Anybody wanting to answer?
Yeah, I can. I'm absolutely
Thank you
happy
very much,
to answer. So I
Katie.
think one of the biggest issues in terms of prevention really is that there's huge systemic issues. There's a lot of problems in terms of systems that people are relying on day to day. And we find a lot of young people are battling challenges that we don't really recognise. You know, they live in a whole different universe to us as adults, and particularly as professional adults. So a lot of the time we see young people really struggling with things that we wouldn't even think about. And when they are referred to services, those services are not set up adequately, I guess, to safeguard those children or potential perpetrators for that matter. So we do find a lot of the time that, you know, prevention could be much better had there been intervention earlier or more focused intervention, I guess. And yeah, I think separating those definitions of CSA, CSE definitely causes some confusion for people, and it causes a lot of issues in terms of the way in which we deal with exploitation in real life, because a lot of that overlaps. We see a lot of child sexual abuse taking place in these exploitative situations. Even with criminal exploitation, we see it a lot. You know, there's an element of sexual abuse taking place in these criminal exploitation situations. So I think having those kinds of like separated definitions can cause a lot of issues for real life intervention to take place.
Can I just come in on that point a little bit about kind of how I noticed you said adequately set up services, and I want to add to that properly commissioned services. So I think there's something, you know, I'll own it. I'm currently working in a local authority. Rightly, local authorities get a lot of stick for kind of setting up services that maybe aren't designed with, but are designed to do to. And I think there's also something really interesting and really concerning that we all need to think about and address about these kind of binaries, and like, it's a cliche, isn't it, but it's kind of siloed ways of thinking about young people, services that are set up perhaps not in a way that is very accessible to young people, and then this, I'm gonna call it a sort of obsession with the binary of being a victim or a perpetrator, this idea that you cannot possibly have the duality that all human beings have, that actually if you are harming other people, you're perhaps not deserving of protection. And then I'm sure we're going to come on to it in a later question, but just to kind of dunk it in there, Rashida, you talked a little bit about criminalisation, but also just we'll all be aware, I'm sure, of, there's been stuff in the national press recently, hasn't there, but of massive interagency adultification of young people, treating young people who are sometimes as young as 10 or 11 as young adults because of some behaviours that they're demonstrating, which are showing us that they're really traumatised and distressed. But the way that they then are offered a service, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have, or one of the biggest challenges that we need to kind of address in order to move downstream to prevention instead of just reacting to really significant harm.
Indeed. So just to labour that point, how do you think the perceptions of who is and who isn't a victim currently shape services? Again, open to either of you.
It's a huge problem. It's a huge issue. I think there is no perfect victim. There is no perfect perpetrator, and people, much like Lucy said, you know, there is duality. I think it's difficult for people to understand that, you know, if somebody does something wrong, that doesn't mean they're wholly a bad person. They are multifaceted. At the end of the day, everybody is human, and so we all have different sides of ourselves that we show. Some of those things we do may not be reflective of who we actually are. So I think, especially when you're young and particularly vulnerable, all children are inherently vulnerable just by being children. So they're really already on the back foot, I guess. So I think for a lot of us as professionals working with young people, we find, you know, that these young people are put in unimaginable positions that we couldn't really navigate well at that age either. So I think there's a lot of like you said, that kind of adultification is happening all the time. There's a lot of responsibilising of victims in these situations. Young people are being brought into, we were talking earlier about that kind of group-based offences, and you will see a lot of young people being brought in to then recruit others and bring other young people along. Ultimately, they are becoming a perpetrator of those offences. But are they still a victim? Of course they are. You know, they're still being coerced just the same as anybody else in that situation. So there is a real issue, I guess, around the way that we perceive perpetrators and victims. And I think we'll never really have a perfect person to say this is what a victim looks like and this is what a perpetrator looks like. But yeah, I think for that reason, systems are not set up well to deal with, you know, the reality of the situation. There are lots of people we find who are in really difficult positions but have no real way of getting out of that without criminalizing themselves, unfortunately. And that kind of criminalization of children is rampant at the moment. Even we're seeing it at the moment with, you know, if a child sends in an explicit image of themselves to somebody else, they can be criminalized for that. But the children, and they're being coerced into sending those images. So are they the victim or are they the perpetrator of the crime? I think, yeah, ultimately it's a very grey area at the moment, and hoping soon there will be some clarity around that in terms of criminalisation.
There's something about system design as well, isn't there, that we, you know, any of us who've worked on the periphery even of the criminal legal system, sometimes called the justice system, or on the periphery of policing, will have seen that there is often or there appears to be, and young people repeatedly tell us that it feels like that, so that there appears to be a trade-off of we'll only help you if you tell us everything, we'll only do an NRM if you tell us who is grooming you, and then that little bit of, and if you're kind of willing to be a perfect victim, i.e. be sorry and say I'm not going to do it again, or I recognise that was silly or dangerous or whatever. So there's some sort of kind of, by design, I think, trade-off of, in order to receive the care that you clearly are entitled to, you need to give us information that we need. And local authorities are sort of kind of guilty of that, or can be guilty of that, in that we often want to take a lot of information from you. And we all talk about mapping and intel and all this stuff, but really, for a young person hearing that, you know, they will say to us, it feels like you're just mining us for information, and then you might not actually be able to meaningfully make any difference to our safety, so why would we tell you?
Indeed.
So we've got to find a way to be more culturally competent with adolescents, but also to show them that we are advocating for significant systemic change in these big, massive institutional systems that they find themselves inhabiting.
Yeah, it's such a difficult kind of tightrope to walk, because we want the information so that we can think about community safeguarding, but the individual kind of child safeguarding, that individual child that's we're charged to do, is also should be our highest context in those situations, and we are kind of balancing the community safety alongside the individual safety. I was listening to a podcast actually the other day, and where Anna Glinsky from the Centre of Excellence for Child Sexual Abuse, always get that muddled sometimes, but highlighted the link between harm inside of the home and the role it can play, or like correlation in exploitation outside of the home. So whether that be criminal or sexual. I mean, obviously her expertise is on the sexual, but that there was definitely some overlap and interplay in terms of criminal exploitation. So I guess my question to you is, what role does the harm inside the home play in exploitation?
I had this conversation with Anna personally not that long ago, actually. There was lots of overlap in terms of exploitation and intrafamilial harm. So we will see a lot of the time that young people are being exploited by their own families, by their parents, you know, and I think there's a real focus on what's going on outside the home and who's got access to that child who isn't in their immediate family, but sometimes it's the immediate family themselves. So there is some issue, I think, around the risk factors that we really heavily focus on in our professional lives. I guess a lot of us think, oh, well, these risk factors must mean this child is at risk of exploitation, but no child is ever going to be abused or exploited unless they're around the perpetrator. A perpetrator can be anybody. And again, it goes back to what we think of as a society. Who is a perpetrator? Who is a victim? Ultimately, a perpetrator can be anybody. And we all think, oh, not me, you know, not my family, not my friends. But statistically, you know, we all know somebody who is an offender. So it's really it's important to remain open-minded, I guess, in those situations, and realise that it's not walking around pointing the finger at everyone and saying, oh, well, you could be, or you could be, but just being very aware that these people are everywhere, that they, you know, are in all different types of positions. Some of those people are mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, you know, and if they've got access to children, then those children are at risk of being exploited or abused. So, yeah, there are definitely risk factors within the home. Neglect, obviously, is a huge issue. If children are not being supervised adequately, then there's a good chance they'll go out there and find themselves in some kinds of trouble. But it's important to not always focus really heavily on the child's circumstances, because ultimately the child is going to be the person who is victimized in the situation, and we want to really focus on the perpetrator and what adults, I guess, have got access to that child at all times, not just when they're not under the supervision of their family.
And I'm just, it's making me think a little bit about something that I'm doing in my team every single day is monitoring on a daily basis children who go missing. I'm in a big London local authority. That's multiple children a day, sometimes for extended periods. And I think we, as a system, we professionals, we safe adults, we who position ourselves to be safe adults, tend to think about missing children who go missing as perhaps young people, adolescents, sort of asserting agency and autonomy and just not doing what the parents tell them to do. Or we think about this cliche and often quite inaccurate kind of kids in care who run away because they've had a terrible life. And actually, whilst that's all true, those things are all true, there are also young people who are showing us that home isn't safe by going missing. We know that that's a really significant sort of push factor. What's happening at home can be a really significant push factor out of the home. But then I'm often sitting in meetings, and as you can probably tell already, I will very, very loudly challenge that stuff. But I hear people talking about, you know, it's not that we're not worried about what's happening at home. We're worried about what could be happening when the child is out of the home. But really, there's something about, we've got to flip that script and start thinking, you know, the basic question when a child is missing is why? Why do they not feel safe at home? What is happening at home? And although it's really, really important and significant that we've started in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years to talk about harm outside the home and extra familial risk and contextual safeguarding, we also have to not forget intrafamilial, exactly as Katie said. We have to be able to do both, and we have to think about what was happening 3 or 4 years ago. What questions could we have asked then that would help us to understand why this child is now not wanting to be at home, and what do we need to think about? What are they being exposed to? Who are they being exposed to when they're out of the home? And then there's some really very complex, very nuanced work supporting families whose children go missing and helping them to understand that actually the safest place for their child is at home, even if that's safe uncertainty, even if home is not perfectly safe. We have to find ways to manage that, and, you know, and to keep children in their homes if we possibly can. But there is something about missing. I'm not going to sort of bang the drum about a national missing children inquiry, although there does need to be one, but we really need to better understand missing. I imagine lots of people in the audience are social workers, and probably from somebody like me get really annoying daily missing reports, Merlin's, safeguarding triages, whatever they're called now, and they think, oh, I've got to go and do a return home conversation. Yeah, you do. You need to go and ask that child what was happening when they were missing, why they went, where they are, what was happening when they were missing. Because if we don't understand that, then of course young people are going to stop telling us. If we don't ask the right questions about what's happening when you're not in the home and why is it that you don't want to be in the home, we're never going to get the information that we need to keep them safe.
Absolutely agree with you there, Lucy. Just thinking about having those conversations, thinking about, you know, doing the joining up of, you know, the push and pull factors. Who do you think needs to be involved in kind of those conversations and, you know, sourcing that information? I'm a social worker by trade as well, and sometimes it wasn't always the social worker who was best placed to have those conversations. They weren't always the trusted person who could elicit that information. So I'm just wondering, you know, what both Katie and Lucy, like who might need to be involved in sourcing that information and thinking about and reframing some of the things like going missing and, you know, home being a not so safe place and things like that.
I think there's something, I'm sure Katie, I think probably can speak to this in a much more eloquent way than me, but there's something so important that we must not lose sight of, which sits outside of statutory social work, so voluntary sector, community organisations, community level organisations, people who actually, you know, the village, people who actually know that child, people who that child can relate to. Obviously, I'm going to say youth work because, you know, I think non-stat youth work is life safe, but the joining up of having those people, those safe, trusted relationships which requires actually commissioning funding and paying for people, otherwise they can't do it. Join that up with the power of really good statutory working, proper multi-agency statutory working. There might be some people on the call. I know certainly the board, the Frontline board, came a little while ago to Wandsworth to see a sort of piece of work we do, which we talked about in my intro, Rashida. It's by no means perfect, and I'm not sort of positioning it here as like this is something everybody should do. But if you're working in local authority and you do not have a daily kind of hot off the press understanding of who is missing in our borough at the moment, who's been arrested, who's having any police contact, who's been stopped and searched, who are we receiving police safeguarding reports for, then you cannot really profess to have any sort of kind of current contextual understanding. So in Wandsworth, we introduced this meeting, which is essentially where we meet every single morning and we review the previous snapshot, previous 24 hours, and it's a tasking meeting. So we're looking at who's missing, who's still missing from yesterday, who's been had contact with the police, and then any kind of safeguarding triages, what used to be called a Merlin. And we learned from that a social worker and a police officer, a MASH police officer doing that together is, looks good on the tin, and Ofsted might like it, but it's not actually effective. What you need is MASH, social care, other social care kind of services, early help, youth work, education, the police. You need a proper multi-agency group to help you to understand all the different pieces of the jigsaw, which then help you understand what you actually need to do. And I'm pretty tired of talking to people about we've got to just get over this information sharing stuff. Every single serious case review or child safeguarding practice review you've ever had tells us we have to get over this. Oh, well, the community youth worker or the mentor is telling us this, but we're not going to write that down on the system because we're not sure if that's legit. Or the police do know information, but they're not going to tell us. Or we're not going to invite housing into that conversation, even though housing know that the property's being cuckooed, because let's not have too many cooks spoil the pot. Rubbish. Like, we need properly joined up conversations that don't happen every 3 months in a panel, that happen every single day, and keep it alive, so that we can then go to commissioners and say, we know that children are being exploited or being abused, being harmed in this particular part of our community. We know that, let's use Rain, are already working in that area, know a lot of the young people, are joined up with the youth service. Let's actually commission them and give them some money and put a service in that responds to that need, because that is preventative work. That's my
I would agree.
Yeah.
I agree entirely. I think that there is there should be more of a push around real multi-agency approach, because I think a lot of the time we say multi-agency because that's what we're supposed to say, but it doesn't actually work like that in reality. We've found that a lot of people don't really even understand each other's job roles, and so there are little bits being missed here and there, but it all adds up eventually. But yeah, ultimately I'd say peer support is our best bet and things like that. If you find that a young person is having difficult conversations or struggling to have those conversations with professionals, bring somebody in who understands that young person on their level, somebody who gets what they're going through. I do some peer support work outside of Rain, actually, and it's mostly supporting people through the police process and the court process when they've been a victim of child sexual abuse, because it's not a pleasant experience to go through that alone, and even with all of the most well-willed professionals on your side, it still feels very isolating as an experience. I think criminal exploitation is very similar in that respect. There are hundreds of thousands of children affected by this every single year, but they still each one feel like they're on their own in that, nobody else really understands what they specifically have been through. So it's great to have somebody who really gets that, and someone who's able to kind of approach it from a different point of view, I guess. But yeah, in terms of the way in which we deal with these types of conversations, I think having support for young people that is specifically for that young person, as opposed to trying to push along some other kind of narrative, I guess, it is essential. I think if we want to focus on being victim focused and really supporting people in the situations they're in, then having peer support is essential.
Yeah, no, I would definitely attest to both of your sentiments. Whilst I was a frontline social worker and frontline manager, I distinctively recall having a young person who was missing, classified officially missing, for an extended period of time, and our only lifeline to know what was going on and that he was alive was the youth worker that he would attend.
For sure.
To go, and it's the only way that we could reassure mum that he was okay, and how he then found a safe place with the youth worker, but then encouraged others who were missing or to touch base. And that was amazing lifeline and that peer support. And they only agreed to do that because he advocated for it. So absolutely agree with those your sentiments and your ideas about how we need to shift and reshape how we look at victims and those who are criminally exploited, because actually he became a part of the safeguarding plan for many others. Amazing. Even though he was at risk as himself. So we were kind of talking about a multi-agency kind of response, and I getting into multi-agency as in there's multi-agency as we tick box, that's what we need to be doing, and then there's the stuff that we really need for it to be meaningful. So what does successful multi-agency collaboration look like? I think both of you touched on this before, but maybe just even if you've got some good practice examples or anything. So what does good multi-agency collaboration look like to prevent exploitation, look like in practice?
People need to understand each other better. There needs to be conversations around what is your job role, what can you do within your limitations, and what can I do to help assist you in that. So I think for a lot of the people that we work with, because we predominantly work with local authorities, social workers, early help team, we work with a lot of people who are in positions where they find the system is really not really fit for purpose at this point. And I think that might be a bold statement to make, but I would say, the systems are very difficult to navigate for professionals and victims alike. So if you're a service user or somebody who's engaging with the service, you can find it very difficult to navigate that, but the professionals are right there with you. So having those kinds of conversations is really important. We held an event quite a long time ago now, but where we brought professionals together, and those professionals were able to have conversations with each other about what they do. We always really push resources like the CSE Centre for people to really understand what legally are they allowed to say and not say when they are kind of taking disclosures from people or working on around child sexual abuse, because there is a real fear of jeopardizing somebody's case. But if that's not your job, if your job is to support that child by any means, I think we need to stop focusing so much on other people's role and let them worry about that. That's their job and they can do that adequately while you also do your job effectively. So it's important that we understand each other and we have a better gauge, I guess, of what we can and can't do in our positions, but also advocate for change in your system. If you're finding your system isn't fit for purpose, be an advocate for changing that.
No, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree, Katie. Did you want to come in with about any of that, Lucy? I know you spoke quite a bit about multi-agency working before, very passionately, might I add. So I don't want to, to drag it, but if you wanted to add anything to, what the successful multi-agency collaboration look like in terms of preventing.
I mean, I think it's an advocacy thing, really. It's kind of but it's making me think a bit about how, this is a huge area of kind of emerging specialism, emerging research, and I think people can feel a bit fearful or sort of intimidated, or like I don't know enough about it to get involved, or I don't want to ask the wrong questions or whatever it is. But there's also something about many people who are listening in will be supervisors, leaders, are working in teams, and there's something for me about, even when we're feeling overwhelmed, and I've just actually had a quick look at Q&A and I can see some like, oh, it all feels a bit futile, which we'll come to. It isn't hopeless. We can make really significant, really meaningful change to young people's lives and therefore to the trajectory of their future. But in order to do that, yes, we need to come together and understand what each other are doing. Yes, we need to share information properly, but I think we also need to get out of our heads a bit, and there's something about getting stuck in the kind of individual cases or young people, particularly if you're a frontline social worker, just doing the work with that family or that young person and not having the headspace, either because that's not enabled by your manager or your system or whatever, to step out and think, actually there's pattern here, or there's something happening, I'm noticing something happening.
Sussana, you have arrived. Thank you so much for bearing with the technical issues and joining anyway. I was just I posed the question about what good multi-agency working looks like. And if you wanted to, Lucy's back, great. If you wanted to add some contributions, we'll be grateful to hear it.
Yeah, sure. I love what Lucy and Katie have shared on that. I think healthy advocacy also looks like healthy challenge within those multi-agency spaces. You know, again, kind of going back to what was being said previously in preventing exploitation, without the legislation that we need that gives us those clear definitions and clear responses to exploitation victims, it's left very subjective to the multi-agency professional. And so where there's that subjectivity, there's also room for bias. What does that look like for the Black, the brown child, the child in care? We know there's significant disproportionalities and racial disparities within the criminal justice system. What does that mean for the child that's being exploited, that's Black, brown, Asian, into crimes via the gang model, for example? What do the biases mean in how we're able to see and identify that child as a victim rather than an offender or even a perpetrator? So where we're seeing those biases within those multi-agency circles, healthy advocacy looks like healthy challenge, calling out the biases, making it very transparent what the indicators, the evidences are to really highlight the victim status of that child, and doing it again in a healthy way that's really speaking for the voiceless child in that situation, who 99.9% of the time doesn't even know they're a victim themselves. So healthy multi-agency services is working together with challenge that can be accepted in a healthy way and given in a healthy way. So we're all meeting the needs for that child, and that child's able to access care in an equal way as well.
Oh, absolutely agree. It was worth the wait, Sussana, for you to come in with that. Absolutely love it. So I think I've got space for one more question, and I left this question to last for me on purpose because I feel like this is the most important thing. It's the one thing I'm so passionate about. But you also mentioned it, Sussana, bringing the voice of the voiceless child. How can we ensure that the voices of children with lived experience of exploitation are essential in shaping the prevention strategies that, the systemic change that we're talking about? How can we use those voices of children? And I would love for you to speak from your individual perspectives, but I would like all of you to answer if that's okay. Are you on a roll, Sussana? Do you want to go first?
Go on. And I believe it all comes back to relationship. As in my role as a social worker, within exploitation, I'm only able to advocate for that child and give that child a voice if I really know that child, if I really understand their experiences within education, within the home, within the community, how they see themselves, how they identify themselves. Without really having that relationship and understanding, the different parts of their lives, I'm not able to advocate and speak and be. Essentially, my role is to be an echo. I'm there to amplify what that child is saying they need, the experiences of that child, and I'm amplifying that child's voice in an arena that should then drive a response to their voice. I'm also listening for the unsaid things as well. What are they not saying? And what are the concerns around what they're not saying? So it means that I'm being consistently curious, and I'm really exploring the things that they're afraid to say and why are they afraid to say it. And again, I'm bringing that into a multi-agency space and using their own voice to advocate rather than my own opinion. So it might be within meetings, it might be within assessments, it might be in having quite passionate conversations with certain services. But I have that assurance that I'm not speaking from my opinion, I'm speaking on behalf of that child. And so whatever that child needs, I'm determined to get a response to meet that need, and so they can access that care, that support. And I think that has to be the fundamental way in which we're really listening to, well, we're able to promote the needs of that child relationship. It has to come from relationship and becoming that trusted person that the child can then speak to.
Amazing, Susan. I couldn't agree more.
Sorry, but just on that bit about curiosity and sort of extending that a bit more to asking why not, or who should be here, who isn't. I think one of the things that is fundamental to my practice is that, and I'm sure everybody's, is that we cannot do anything for without, and that can become a bit cliche. We have to be wary of tokenism. We also have to think about kind of exceptionalism and whose voices get privilege. But something that we have managed to do in a local authority where there is no money, because there's never any money in local authorities and there's a lot of bureaucracy, by just asking why not, we have managed to get a group of young people and parents who have a lot of lived experience, establish them as a group of experts by experience who are paid for their time. So that, and we've talked a lot about the kind of dynamic of being paid for your experience and what does that mean, and how do we make sure that we're not tokenizing it or we're not re-traumatizing people. But actually, by asking why not, by being a sort of an advocate, but also a self-professed difficult woman, we have got young people and their families who have lived experience of exploitation, of working in the criminal legal system, in front of councillors, at the all-party parliamentary group, at national scale conversation. And that's just because we said, why not? Why are they not allowed to be in that conversation? Why is it, quote unquote, not appropriate to invite the auntie to this meeting? So I think it's something about kind of radical courage and just being like, actually, unless it's going to cost you your job, asking your kind of senior leadership, well, why not? Why can't we pay families to be part of a consultation process? Why can't we pay people to be involved in commissioning? Why can't we go out to the community and ask them what they think we should do? So there's something about being radical, but also having the humility to understand that actually, yes, we can advocate for, yes, we can echo, yes, absolutely, we can bring people's voices to things, but actually the more efficient way is to bring them to the things, or to bring the things to them and not just hide in the local authority building or whatever it is, but to actually go out into community and ask them. So yeah, it's something about extending that curiosity beyond the kind of individual level at a more strategic level of like, well, what, all right, we've been doing it like this for 5 years, but actually it doesn't work. So why don't we do something else?
Really helpful reflections. I'm conscious that I'm now bleeding into the Q&A section, but I really want to hear from Katie. I'm sorry to make shorten your response, but yes, Katie, your views.
That's fine. I'll be as concise as possible. So ultimately, I would just say, like, I mean, from a youth worker perspective, I definitely agree with Susanna. I think building those relationships is really important. And I think for victims of exploitation and abuse particularly, a lot of the time you'll find that their voice, their choice and their control is being taken away. So allowing them to have some of that back is really important. It really does create an environment for meaningful change and real, you know, preventative work for those and supportive work for those young people. So I think very vital to build those relationships up with young people and ensure that actually you are a trusted person in their life. They do have somebody they can go to talk to if they need that. And I think that's the way that you keep things kind of central around. You want to champion the voice of that victim, that survivor, that young person in the middle of this conversation. These conversations are often had without them, and can come as a bit of a shock sometimes. I think that, you know, all these professionals getting together and talking about me, why, and I don't know what's going on. I'm not involved in that, so it can be quite frustrating, I think, for young people in the centre of that situation. So really bringing them in, bringing in the perspective of the people around them who mean a lot to them is really important. I agree with Lucy entirely around paying people for their time. I think we have a real like taboo issue around that kind of incentivizing, but actually paying people is really important. You know, people can't just give up their time for no reason. And even if we think it's really helpful and really meaningful to them, it might not be benefiting them at all. So it's important that there is some benefit to those people. You know, ultimately they are the experts. You know, they've been through those systems, they know how they work from a real life perspective, not from a professional perspective. And so for those people, they are giving you information and a perspective that you would never see outside of that. So it's important that those people realize the worth of that. I work as an expert by experience every single day, and I'm paid for that job, and I should be paid for that job. I don't do this because I think, it's fun to do. I do it because it's a great job to have. You know, I'm making meaningful change, but also, you know, I'm paid well for that, and that provides a nice life for me to be able to continue this work alongside, you know, enjoying my family and whatever else it is that I like doing. So I think incentivizing is important, and this idea that you shouldn't pay people is bananas to me. Also, I think, you know, lots of young people are not listened to, because we go, oh, well, they're young and they don't understand, they're not fully developed and whatever, they can't comprehend things to the same degree that we can. Great, that's fine. If that's the situation, work with adult survivors, adults who have been through these same systems, who have navigated all of this previously and now are fully developed and able to give their input. So I think there lots of us came together within the Rain Collective because we were failed by a lot of systems that should have been there to support us and help us and just didn't. So now we're able to make that kind of meaningful change because people listen to adults. So I think bring people in who run organisations like ourselves. That's not to say you should book us, although we are free anytime, just let us know. But I think it's really important to listen to people who have had that experience. The benefit to the system is huge. So I think, for us, we find that a lot of people kind of go like, oh, well, what do you know? Where's your qualifications? But actually, we can probably bring more to a table than the average professional.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, and for being concise. I think we're going to move over to some of the questions in the Q&A. I have to be honest, I was listening so intently that I haven't been paying a whole lot of attention to the Q&A, the Q&A section. So I'm just going to lean into Nahal. Is there anything that you wanted to pick up and ask the panelists to share, to respond to?
No worries. There are lots of questions actually, but we can start from the very first question. Is there a huge gap caused by the fact that CEOP was merged into NCA? Child exploitation is not an NCA priority, and local police services dealing with child exploitation do not have access to expert advice and support. The focus on a national inquiry masks the fact that the actual crimes are local and opportunistic as much as organized. CEOP used to offer a lot of education, training, advice, and support to local police services. This leads to issues that the panel are correctly identifying. So is there a huge gap? Is the question.
Yeah, I think we all really miss CEOP. CEOP were hugely influential for many years, and the necessity, I would imagine, of merging them into National Crime Agency has meant that some of that kind of a lot of that richness has been lost. That said, there are other kind of emerging networks. There's child exploitation networks. There's the work done by the National Working Group. So there are other places to go and get some of that resource, but also solidarity, just to talk to other people. There are lots of others available, I'm sure, but the National Working Group are fabulous and do plug some of that gap in terms of training, peer support, advocacy, policy kind of landscape stuff. So yes, absolutely right about CEOP, but there's not now just this void. There are other things emerging, which is a good thing.
Andy, thank you so much for your question, and Lucy, thank you for your response. Did somebody did you want to come in, Kate? I saw you nodding a lot, but no,
yeah, I mean, I can do just really briefly. I think there's a really great point to be made here, that the focus on national inquiries does take away from the fact that these things are happening locally and like Andy said, opportunistic as much as organised. So we do really focus heavily on organised group-based offences in this country for whatever reason that is. And I would like to say that there is definitely some ulterior motive in the way that that is presented in the media, I think, particularly from a racial bias, but we definitely have some kind of issue in terms of the way that we look at exploitation. It's really important to remember that actually children are being exploited every single day in a million different ways by a million different types of people, and it's not always the people that we see in the media. It's, you know, people's mothers who are trafficking them across the country. You know, there's children being exploited by other children. It's really important to not be narrow-minded in the way that we look at that crime. And yeah, I do think that there's been a huge gap, I guess, created in the fact that, you know, NCA don't prioritise child exploitation as something that they want to deal with.
Thank you.
Great. Shall we go on to the next question?
Yeah.
Maybe we can take a couple more. That's
Sure.
okay. So there's a question, actually two questions who are very similar to each other, but how best do you think as professionals we can help those young people that are being exploited but do have worries within the family home and are at high risk, which means that they go unnoticed by professionals? And another one that talks about how we can build relationships and interventions, direct work with young people and their families. So I think those can kind of sink into each other.
I think just a brief comment, really. I'm sure Sussana and Kate have got some really much more thoughtful things to say, but it's just making me think a little bit about how do we identify, how do we notice those children who might otherwise be invisible, who appear to be doing well, who don't have a social worker, who perhaps come from a family that we or the system doesn't expect is a family that has an exploited child or whatever it is. There is a huge amount of power in schools, in education. We all need to be noticing children, but, you know, we talk a lot about school sees the children more than we do, and it's true. And anyone who's aware of the big, which I'm sure lots of people will be, the big kind of national social care reform stuff that is currently being talked about and going through kind of in local authorities, education are becoming, as they should always have been, statutory safeguarding partners. So schools, safeguarding in education, education welfare, any sort of education provision will now have a kind of renewed focus, and a statutory one, which is really good, on sharing information. I think there are always going to be some children where we have no idea something has happened until something really frightening happens and we have to respond or kind of react. But often if you go into schools, or if you look at the kind of research from the piloting of school social workers, you'll see that schools do know this stuff. So then for someone in a local authority, it's about creating space for them to tell us those things, or listening, or when I was working in the voluntary sector, about always going to the school and saying, who are you worried about? What are you noticing? Because those incredible people who are still battling through teaching and still working in education, they know those children really, really well, and they will probably have noticed things that won't meet a threshold in MASH or might not otherwise be known about. So there's something about going to where the children are and asking who are you worried about?
Yeah,
that's really helpful.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around bias. I think you do have children that go unseen because you have this idea of what an exploitation victim should look like and what innocent children should look like. And where you've potentially got a child within a home that doesn't look that doesn't meet the standard of a home where a child victim would come from, then we kind of overlook sometimes what's happening for that child. So, for example, I'm currently working with a young boy, 13 years old. I've been working with him on and off for about 2 years. Our police refuse to acknowledge that he's a victim of CCE. Why? His family have a history of gang involvement. And so he's just following the family career path is what the view is. And so his needs are completely being missed. You add into that mix that he's a mixed race child, and his whole family are of mixed race heritage, you've got another bias introduced into that mix. So again, it comes back to what is our idea of a victim? What's our idea of an innocent child? And a victim isn't always going to look in our kind of standards, present as a victim. They might have aggression because of the trauma. They might be loud because of fear. They might be withheld emotionally, or kind of really defensive. There's underlying causes for that, and actually, does that indicate more of their victim status than the child that presents more like a victim? So we really need to look at things very differently. It's not one size fits all for victims of exploitation, criminally or sexually. And this is a struggle that I have in working personally with some agencies, because there is this idea, I think, particularly with police, where they have to see evidence, which I completely understand, but evidence isn't always presented as evidence. So I think we really have to, again, go back to that curiosity, go back to that digging. And if we need to find that evidence and support that child to present evidence, then we do that, and we take it to where we need to take it to, whether it's NRMs, whether it's to police. But the high-risk children are usually the ones that are in plain sight, i.e. where there's crime already in the home or there's neglect in the home.
Sussana, I'm so glad I gave you that last ability to comment on that. I've got less than a minute left, and Frontline's very, very good on timing. So just wanted to, again, another shout out to our panelists. You've been absolutely amazing.